Hello and welcome to PoetryEast at the London Buddhist Centre. My name is Satyadasa. It's normally Maitreya Bandhu who hosts these evenings, these occasions, but today it's me. So hello, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming the writer Paul Kingsnorth. Paul is the author of 10 books, including The Wake, his first novel, which won the Gordon Byrne Prize and was longlisted for the Booker Prize. As a journalist, Paul appeared regularly right across the national press and had a stint as deputy editor for The Ecologist. He went on to write 2 works of non-fiction about the destruction of local ways of life around the world, and a provocative collection of essays called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. He also co-founded the Dark Mountain Project to encourage writers in what he calls uncivilized writing. Paul has now completed a trilogy of novels, 2 volumes of poetry, and Savage Gods, which is a raw and confessional account of a crisis of confidence in words and writing. And so aside from all that and much more, Paul works a small holding at his home in rural Ireland, where he lives with his wife and children. And he teaches anyone who's interested how to use a scythe. So welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Great. Well, Paul, I've been reading a lot of your work. I had already read quite a lot of it before, and I find it very forcefully argued. It's always also feelingful. It's passionate. It's also soulful with a lovely vein of wry English humour running through it. But it's radical, I would say, also in the genuine sense of that word, in that it goes to the root. And I think it's fair to say that your writing is not for, it comes with a health warning. It's not for anyone who's wanting to keep a rosy view of civilizational progress. It comes, I think, from a sense of loss, and you unfold the awareness of that and the scale of that in ever greater depth. Loss, of course, of the natural world and the grief about that, the inevitable grief, the loss of a meaningful culture, how that's been hollowed out by the forces which benefit from really reducing us to being consumers of things and experiences. And then the loss, more subtle, which Thomas Berry, who you quote, he calls the loss of the great conversation, this conversation between the human and the other than human. And ultimately, the loss of the connection to the divine. But it's not a bleak catalogue of loss, your work. I find that what it offers me is the power, the very power of you telling that story so clearly. The deeper imagination gives me a way into the predicament. I find myself, like so many people nowadays, really struggling to make sense of what's going on. So I'm relatively comfortable life, of course, I have that, but there's so much going on in the world, it's hard to make sense of it in these times. And and also you shy away from offering big solutions in your work, but you do write about adopting human scale technology, about learning to really listen to nature. You also write about your time practicing Zen Buddhism and embodiment. And also you've more lately written about your Christian faith. So there's a lot of we could discuss, plenty of big topics. But I'd like to go back, if we can, to your early life. You were born in the 1970s in the suburbs of London, as was I. And I gather we both spent quite a bit of time playing games on our ZX Spectrum.
Good old days, yeah.
The good old days, yeah. A lot of the time was just spent waiting for the games to load up in my memory.
Exactly.
And your father took you on some pretty vigorous walks around the countryside, around the hills of Britain. And then as a young adult and a budding writer, you found yourself involved in the road protests. Now, these were not like the road protests that have been going on around London around this time. They were on the hills, the chalk downs of southern England. I wonder if you could just tell us what that was like back then, and what were you like back then?
Big question, eh? Well, I think you've kind of covered my whole biography, so I probably don't have anything to add. It's all there. That was a very good potted story. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like from a young age, I've felt that sense of something missing in the world, and something missing that it's always difficult as a writer to disentangle your own personal sense of whatever it is you're searching for from the kind of state of the world at the moment. But certainly, as you say, I got dragged across a lot of mountains by my dad when I was young, which I enjoyed mostly, although not always. Lots of long distance walks for weeks and weeks and weeks right across the Pennines and across the Welsh mountains and all sorts of other places. Back in the 80s, when wild places were a bit more wild as well, there were no mobile phones, there was no GPS. You went up on a mountain, you were really away from things, and that did something to me, because that showed me the world outside the suburbs of London for a start, but it also connected me to something very much bigger than me and much bigger than humans, and it gave me a sense of what I suppose Wordsworth would have called the sublime, which when I now look back on it, I see as a sense of the divine in nature and in creation, the kind of the non-human world. And you can feel that. We can all feel that when we go up into the wild places and spend enough time there. There's a kind of communication that goes on. So I had all that going on when I was a kid, didn't really understand it, but I could feel it. And when I went to college, as you say, it was the time of the road protests, and what was happening back in the 90s is that the government were rolling out what they called the biggest road building program since the Romans. They were very proud of that. A lot of motorways across the country, not all of them in the countryside, actually. I mean, in fact, in London, there was a huge protest against the construction of the M11, the extension of the M11 motorway, which went through a lot of urban areas and involved a lot of demolition of houses in working class communities. But certainly in Twyford Down and the Newbury bypass and other places, there was the not dissimilar situation to what you're seeing today, actually, with the building of the HS2 extension, is the mass destruction of ancient woodlands and hill forts and the other kind of the sacred places, really, the parts of the nation that connect nature to culture, and the demolition of that so that people could, for example, get from London to Southampton 6 minutes quicker than they could before, was so obviously wrong to a lot of us that we sort of sat in the way. Effectively, we sat up the trees and we dug tunnels under the roads. And I mean, I was very much a kind of weekend warrior. I would come down from college for a few days at a time, so I wasn't one of the really committed people at all. But it was a very transformative experience for me, because it made me realize that a lot of dots were connected. That I had a strong sense already that there was a kind of divine power in nature, that our connection to the natural world was very much part of who we are, and I could see it being destroyed around me. And then, of course, when you start to join the dots, you start to ask why these roads being built, and you get answers which are not just about driving times from London to Southampton. They're also about the global economy, and they're about consumerism and capitalism, and then that's about the way we live and the values we have as a culture, and it's about where we're going and what progress means, and all of these very big questions, which of course have been asked for a long time, but are getting, as you say, much more urgent now. I mean, these questions, which have been raised for centuries by thinkers from all over the world, are really all the chickens are coming home to roost at this point. So, but for me, that was the road protests were a really formative thing, and for a lot of people of my generation, a lot of activists, very much a formative thing that we can still sort of look back on as old men now, with a sense of that brings together nature and culture, and these kinds of very local acts of resistance to kind of Moloch or the machine, or whatever you want to call it. They can really bring into focus a lot of very much bigger issues, that really manifest at the local level.
That's really interesting. Yeah, those road protests have sort of entered the folklore, haven't they? They did enjoy, my perception or my memory is they did enjoy quite a lot of popular consent as well. Is that your opinion, maybe?
Yeah, they did. And that was very interesting, because when they started, I mean, the people who kicked off the road protests were really the travelers. They were the people right out on the margins, the people who used to be called New Age travelers by the media. And they were the ones who had nothing to lose. And they were really the people who set up camps in these places. And then the rest of us joined them later. The activists joined them, but then others joined them. And what was interesting is that, initially you look at the media coverage and the way that the politicians behaved, their reaction was to demonize the protesters and call them hippies and Luddites and ne'er-do-wells and scroungers and the usual thing. But as you say, actually, it turned out that most of the country was on their side. So when we were down at Twyford Down, we used to have a lot of kids from Winchester Public School coming up to the hill to join us around the fires. You know, a lot of these enormously privileged people from very posh schools would just come and say, oh, I'm part of this. And so would the local people from the villages around Twyford. Very often you'd get, you know, you'd sit around a fire in Twyford Down, and there'd be some you know, sort of a local housewife who'd cooked a casserole and brought it up, and then there'd be a kid from a public school, and sometimes there'd be a policeman who quietly thought it was a good idea as well. He'd been kind of sent up there to keep an eye on us, but he'd sit around the fire and have a smoke and say, yeah, I'm basically on your side. And it was very interesting, quite a wide range of people from different classes and backgrounds. And that reflected in the media coverage, which eventually changed and ended up being quite supportive. And one of the reasons that although those roads were built, the wider road project was cancelled in the end, the road scheme that the government had, was because public opinion turned. And it turned because actually it turned out that the country as a whole did not want to see its heritage and landscape destroyed for car culture. Now, of course, what you have there then is a contradiction, because we always say that, but then we drive cars. And that's the contradiction that our whole culture finds itself in now. And we all find ourselves in, actually. You know, we want to stop the climate changing, but we don't want to stop going on holiday in planes. And we want to stop the destruction of the landscape, but we don't want to stop the cheap goods that we like. And that's, as I say, the kind of microcosm of all of that happening on an English hill is still, to me, my personal picture of what the whole world looks like, these enormous contradictions and strains that the whole of the culture is under, and that we're all under all the time, and the different things that we want, the different directions we want to go in. And the fact that it's harder and harder and harder to pretend that we can reconcile any of that anymore. So that's, yeah, it's, as you say, there's almost a line that you can draw from that to where we are now.
I mean, I have to admit that the M11 link road made it a lot easier for us to drive out to our rural retreat centre in Suffolk.
There you go.
Otherwise, it was an hour stuck on the Leytonstone High Road.
Well, of course, that's how it works, isn't it?
That is right, yeah. So after a good stint writing about these issues, you describe yourself as an eco-activist journalist, writing in The Guardian, The Telegraph, all over the place. You had a kind of, I mean, I don't think that aspect of your life has been consistent, it seems, that feeling that you had back then, but something changed in your relationship to the what we call the green movement, or the environmental movement.
Yeah, well, really, just over a long period of time, I realized that, as plenty of other people did, that the things I wanted to make happen weren't going to happen. To some extent, again, you have to sort of try and disentangle your own personal ego desire from what's going on in the world. You know, you can have your young sort of angry activist man hat on, as I had, wanting to change the world and thinking you were kind of clever enough to work out how to do it, and realizing that about 1 million people before you have thought that, and that isn't going to happen. And that's a good realization, actually. That makes you smaller than you thought you were, which is always good. But more to the point, it's, you know, as a young activist, I went out there wanting to change the world, as we all do, and realized, you know, over a long period, it wasn't like some sudden flash of realization, but just over a long period of working, it was obvious that the things that the green movement was calling for were not going to happen. And fundamentally, for example, I mean, I've lost count of the number of times that I heard we had X months or X number of days to save the earth from climate change. I mean, that line was used about 100 times in about a 10-year period. It was obvious that what we needed to do in the grand scheme of things globally, what we needed to do as a civilization to prevent, for example, the climate from changing, or to prevent the mass extinction that we're already living in from getting worse, basically to turn the whole thing around, which is what we need to do, to turn the industrial economy around. The things we wanted to do and needed to do were not going to happen, very obviously, and that's self-evidently true now. The interesting thing is that when I started writing about that, I suppose a lot of people disagreed strongly with us at Dark Mountain when we started to put these messages out, and called us doommongers and many other ruder things. But now that kind of, I think that kind of realization is, you'll see it on the front page of newspapers, because it's obviously the case that at this point we're not going to prevent emissions from reaching a level where we get a major climate change, which is already starting to happen. And that's a really difficult thing to process when your whole life is built around the notion that you're an activist who wanted to save the world. So that was, I suppose that was a sort of political collapse for me over a period in maybe my late 20s or early 30s, just thinking this isn't going to happen, is it? This isn't going to happen. For whatever reason, it's not possible to turn this thing around. So then the question was, where does that leave us? Here we are in the early 21st century. We've got all these trends converging, which have been predicted since at least the Limits to Growth report came out in the early 70s, about the time I was born. It's been very, very clear where we're going to go. We're going to go towards a kind of peak and then a crash in terms of resources and climate change and all the other trends. But we can't stop it, or we don't want to stop it, which amount to the same thing. So what do we do? Where do we end up? So I suppose that was then what we spent a lot of time at Dark Mountain starting to think about. Where does that leave us as people if we can't do the things that we thought were necessary to do to sort of turn this thing around?
I mean, I guess, yes, the situation has changed quite a bit since you first put out that message, and probably more people would sort of assent to what you have to say now. But there's an awful lot of people who are still trying to work to save the climate. And for example, the people who are sitting out on the M25, the Insulate Britain people, only in these last weeks. I mean, what I wanted to just really try to get, so, because for me, when I was reading about your turning, I read about it in The Guardian. You had a long sort of series of letters between you and George Monbiot. For me, it was it's quite a crucial thing to understand in where you then go. I'm really interested in where you then go. So where does that leave you? So you say in one of your, you put the situation quite forcefully in many places, but you say in one place that we have two possible futures, one of which is runaway climate change, as you say, for whatever reason that is. And I'd be interested to explore more about what that really, the underlying reason for that is. But we're sort of committed. The story of our times is committed to, not regarding the earth as sacred or despoiling the earth. We're committed to that, and all our technologies and everything else, we need to feed what we've started, and there doesn't seem to be any way out. But then you say, and I'll quote you, you say the other possibility is, or we could create global sustainable society based on large-scale renewable tech, mass rollout of GM crops, nanotechnology and geoengineering, a controlled world of controlled people living in a closely monitored scientific monoculture. So those are the two sort of things, two extremes. Do you see a third way? You don't see a third way by the sound of it.
Well, I mean, that was quite a while ago that I wrote that, I think. Okay. Probably 2009. So, I mean, I did go through a phase of probably almost being like a non-smoker who suddenly really hates smoking. So I was probably a bit more forcefully anti-activist than it was useful to be. So I wouldn't write that now. I wouldn't have a debate like that now. But actually, I mean, I'm not sure that, I mean, these sort of laying out two possible futures, it's to some degree, it's a kind of rhetorical device, isn't it? Which is a reason I wouldn't do it now, I think. But I'm not sure it's so far off either, because the point I was trying to make there, I've made it in other places as well, maybe better, I suppose, and plenty of other people have too, is that, and this was the thing that really disillusioned me about much of the mainstream green movement anyway, is that because we have represented the problem we have as a technological problem, because we have decided that the problem is the wrong kind of gas going up into the atmosphere, the wrong kind of technologies being used, the wrong kind of fuels being used, then the solution is seen as a technological solution. This is the way it works with, with kind of modern capitalism. We see everything in material terms, and in technological terms, if we see a problem, we think there's a technical solution that we can work out for it. And so the entire narrative around environmental issues is now entirely technologically focused and entirely materially focused. And so all of the debates are primarily about how we can reduce emissions quickly, what kind of technology we need to use for that, whether we should be using wind or solar, whether we should be growing meat in labs or not, whether we should be tower farming, whether blah, blah, blah. So you get all these things going on all the time, and they're all really essentially the same question, which is how can we continue to live this high-tech consumer lifestyle that we in the West live? How can everybody else in the world end up living the same way? Because obviously it's the best way to live. And how can we develop the right kind of technology to support that? Now, if that's the question you're asking, and primarily is, at least in the mainstream question that we're asking now, then the solution is always going to head you towards a centralized, very controlled technological culture with probably a social credit system, with smartphone monitoring and scanning, with high-tech everything, with smart houses, with a kind of merging of humans with their technologies. I mean, it's every other day you will hear from the guys in Silicon Valley that they're working on so-called solutions to the environmental crisis. And those solutions always involve artificial intelligence or the mining of asteroids, all of these kinds of things, which 50 years ago you'd have read about in sci-fi books as a kind of grim warning of where we shouldn't go, and are now being promoted as where we are going to be going. So although I wouldn't necessarily put it quite so starkly now, I think that we're very clearly heading towards a very centralized high-tech solution, so-called, to the problem we've created. And to me, that's, if I go right back to the mountains I first walked on when I was about 10 years old, that is really fundamentally the wrong way to look at our relationship with nature. And that's an instinct I've got. It's not an argument I can make, really. It's just a very obvious instinct that I've always had, that there's something very badly wrong with that.
So you went on to found this movement, or called the Dark Mountain Project, and you started to write about dark ecology. I wonder if you could tell us what is, because that dark ecology comes after you've had this instinct, this instinct that we can't solve it with the ways that we're trying to solve it, and that maybe environmentalism, the mainstream of environmentalism, as you say, moved into technique, climate change, tons of carbon in the atmosphere, etc., which doesn't have as much raw appeal as, for example, defending Twyford Down or something. It's a different mindset. Unwittingly, well-meaning and very concerned people, including myself and others, and have wanted. We want to solve the problems, but you went away from that. You came out in your book, The Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. You wrote this famous essay called Dark Ecology. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think I wrote that probably 10 years or so ago, and that was an essay that came out of the early years of the Dark Mountain Project, so it's probably worth introducing that. So the Dark Mountain Project I started in 2009 with another writer, called Hein. And we wrote a little manifesto called On Civilization. And the Dark Mountain Project is sometimes misunderstood as a kind of primitivist political activist group or something like that, which it wasn't. It was always supposed to be, and still is, because it's still going, although I'm not involved in it anymore. It was always supposed to be really an artists group, a group for artists and writers. And we were asking a question as writers, which is, if all of this stuff we've just been talking about is true, all of these radical changes going on in the world, why are writers and artists not really behaving as if it was real? Because they weren't really. And I include myself in that completely. We were sort of writing novels and things as if it was still the 1950s or the 1980s rather than a real ecological cusp. So Dark Mountain was a kind of clearinghouse or a gathering point for people who believed that we couldn't go on as we were, who didn't believe the mainstream stories about how we could turn it all around, and who wanted to explore what that meant, culturally speaking, without necessarily any obligation towards a sort of political solution or a particular answer, or any ideological baggage. It wasn't coming from a particular place in that sense. So I wrote this essay, Dark Ecology, in which I was just trying to work that out for myself. And it really started, I suppose, from the conversation we've just had, having been through all of this and realized that it isn't possible to turn the machine around, if you like, the oil tanker of industrial society. What does that mean? What can you actually do in your life? And that was really a question I wanted to know the answer to, because I didn't know what to do in my life, and half the time I still don't, because it's, how do you live in a time like this? It's a really big question. And really, as I say, I was trying to work out what a sensible life might look like for people like us, I suppose, in the West. And I really just, as I say, I looked at these two options, that the sort of hyper technological future where we try to create a manicured, controlled, technologically human-centered world, right? So that's the trouble with this, really the fundamental problem I have with this tech world, apart from the fact that it probably leads to tyranny, is that it's all about people, really. I was looking in that essay at, for example, the attempts to clone mammoths and reintroduce them into nature, which we're regularly presented with as this terrific story of conservation, but is actually a story about humans attempting to create life. And really what we're doing with this techno focused solution that the Silicon Valley boys and our society as a whole is focused on, is we're trying to rebuild the world in our own image. Rather than living as if we were part of a wider web, we are recreating and rebuilding the wider web to center on us. And we're using the ecological crisis as an excuse to do that. We say, well, look, the climate is changing, the oceans are moving, the currents are shifting, extinctions are going on. So we've got no choice now but to use our technology to manage and rebuild the whole of society. Now, to me, there's something really hideously sacrilegious in that. And I wasn't a religious person at the time, so I wouldn't particularly use words like that, but it was very obviously wrong. And the alternative, it seems to me, is to try and, look, there's no alternative in the sense of coming up with a big political solution, which can often make things worse. But the alternative has to be a kind of spiritual retreat to discover what's true, and then to try and live with the truth of the world. Is there, and the question I suppose I was asking when I look back was, look, is there an objective truth here? Is there a God? What's going on? How do we live? Because this human-centered hubris is going to take us over the cliff, and I still believe that to be true, and we're still going in that direction. So it still ends up being an urgent question for me and for others, I think.
Mm. And I mean, moving sort of onto the cultural analysis, I mean, all of your analysis is it comes together. I can see that more and more, but you talk about that we've become citizens of nowhere in your book, which I love, Real England, The Battle Against the Bland. Again, this was 10 years ago you wrote that, or more. But there you say that we've become, there's a crisis of belonging. This is what you talk about quite a lot. There's a crisis. We're not able to belong anywhere. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, again, I've seen this in so much of my work, and I just keep coming back to it again and again, as you say. So the first book I wrote was called One No Many Yeses, and that came out in 2003, I think. And as you said earlier, that was a book about resistance to globalization. This was back in the sort of the early heady days of anti-globalization activism and summit protests and things like that. I mean, it was before 9/11 that I was writing this book, so it almost seems like another world now. But I traveled around the world, and I met people from different cultures who were resisting the kind of homogenizing power of the global market, the swooping in of everything from the World Bank to some giant global corporation, to the imposition of NAFTA or the latest free trade treaty, this whole system that was really accelerating in the 1990s after the Cold War ended, of effectively the imposition of globalized American capitalism on every community on earth. And I spent time in places like Mexico with the Zapatistas, who had staged an armed rebellion against that, in West Papua, where the tribal people had also staged an armed rebellion against the corporations wrecking their land, and in South Africa, where people were protesting against privatization in the townships, and all these places where people were effectively saying, and this is what I realized when I started writing that book, this is the common thread, that this is the place where we are rooted, and you are attempting to uproot us. You are attempting, and when I say you, I'm talking about these kind of faceless financial global forces, money, corporate power, state power, global capitalism, basically, are doing exactly what Marx and Engels talked about in the Communist Manifesto, actually, which is this endless process of uprooting and churning everything up and destroying all fixed frozen relations, as they called them. And people were resisting from the basis of having their feet on the ground. So I was very inspired by the Zapatista movement in Mexico, which was an indigenous movement, which was saying, look, we have a particular way of life that we want to preserve here. Not preserve in aspect, in the sense that it never changes. There was plenty they wanted to change. But we want the change to come from the ground up rather than from outside. which is basic democracy, really, as far as I can see. It's basic grassroots democracy. And this promise of the global bounty of this great economic machine, which is the same thing that changes the climate and poisons the oceans, is effectively going to, as I said, turn us all into citizens of nowhere. That's the point of it. It doesn't work. And it alienates people from their place and from nature itself and from the communities they live in. And then, yes, I came home, and for a long time, I suppose I'd seen the same thing happening in the country I lived in and came from. And having written that first book, I started to make the connections. I could see, okay, well, look, all over England, the same thing is happening. And so Real England, which was my second book, was an exploration of that. And I wandered around the country, and I spent time in, for example, Newham Market in East London, actually, which was, I think it was the most multicultural market in Europe at that time. And that was under threat of development. There were cafes in the East End, which were going to be bulldozed for housing projects, the gentrification of Chinatown, the privatization of the centre of Liverpool, but also the destruction of, say, family farms and canal sides by development around the country. And the whole thing is the same. The whole thing is this giant placeless global machine moving from country to country, from culture to culture, uprooting people, gentrifying places, taking away the power of local communities and replacing it with the power of the market. And as you said right at the beginning, the resistance to that is radical in the original sense of that word, in that it's rooted in the places that people are in. They may not be the places they come from, but they're the places they're in. They're the communities they're part of. And that actually, to me, has always been a kind of, if I have a politics, that's the lodestone of it, actually. It's a kind of a rooted resistance, a real localism, where people say, this is the community I know and I'm part of, and I want to control it. And we want to decide how we live here. And that's always been, I think if I have a sort of unshifting political principle, it's probably that one. And that has, as you say, that sort of developed, I suppose. I've found more words of that over the years, I suppose.
Although I also notice on your work, there's a bit of ambivalence about belonging. It's belonging to place and community, family, or having a real connection to traditions and culture. That's what you talk about a lot. But there's also an ambivalence. Do we really want to belong? It's easy to, I suppose, sometimes I think it's easy to idealize those traditional cultures, or maybe tribal cultures, or that have a more complete picture, or say a tribal culture has a very complete picture of the universe that they live in. But do we actually want belonging anymore? Are we creatures who just don't really want to belong now?
Well, I think we want both, actually, and I think that's the heart of the problem. I mean, my book Savage Gods, which you mentioned a while back, is a kind of, I suppose it's a kind of midlife crisis book that I wrote a few years back, and that was very much about this kind of push and pull, of wanting to belong somewhere but not necessarily having anywhere to belong to, which has always been the case with me. I mean, I don't have a sort of home community I could go back to, really. I had quite a mobile childhood, which maybe is why I have this obsession with belonging all the time. But it's both. I mean, I think this is the interesting thing. I think that we have made ourselves completely rootless, particularly in the West, which I think is one of the reasons that we're having this giant culture war at the moment, is that people are just, everybody feels lost in a different way. So people want to be rooted. They want communities. They want a sense of place and culture. That's, it's very important to people. If it wasn't, we'd have nothing to argue about, because it would be very simple for us to all become kind of global citizens who see all places as the same as all other places and don't have a relationship to them. And then we'd all be fine. We'd all be perfect kind of global drone citizens by now, but we're not. We're very complex creatures, and we have a connection to culture and place and history and our sense of self and our sense of what our maybe religious community is, or our cultural community or nation. That stuff really matters to people, some more than others, obviously. But at the same time, as you say, that stuff can be limiting. Those things can be limiting, and people want the freedom that this global machine gives us, right? We want that. We want the freedom to travel, and the freedom to move, and the freedom to consume, and all of the other stuff. So although that's hugely destructive, it's also hugely attractive to all of us, including me. So that is the dilemma. That is the dilemma, which is why I ended up, I suppose, is why I end up always coming back to this being a kind of internal struggle, because there isn't there isn't a political solution to this problem, because the problem is not even clearly identified. It's, you know, it is the problem of this kind of runaway want that we have, all of these contradictory impulses that we have all the time. We don't want the landscape to be destroyed for the motorway, but we do like that 20 minutes it saves us on the journey, all of this kind of stuff. So this is kind of the modern temptation, I suppose, in different ways. But I do think that the roots, the culture, the meaning, that stuff is very, very old in us and very important to us.
It's interesting. You say that you point out there that maybe this crisis of belonging that we have is part of something that we all have in common. That could be a cause of what we call the culture war, whether we're clutching at our national identities or any other form of identity. But that's a surrogate for really genuinely belonging. I mean, maybe you've identified something there that we all really do have in common.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the more I think about this, the more it seems to be true. There's a very good book called The Need for Roots by Simone Weil, the French writer, French mystic, I suppose you could say, which was written in the 1940s, which I read recently. And I wrote a little essay about that. And then she identifies this as a kind of need at the heart of effectively all humanity. And she's no conservative. She's very hard to pin down. She doesn't have a kind of political solution to this. But I think it's absolutely true that we are so uprooted in the modern world that, as you say, I feel that people strongly have a sense of loss, and they do construct identities which are almost toxic, sometimes not, imitations of the real thing that they've lost, the kind of communities that are rooted in place and time. Because for the great majority of human history, probably until the last couple of 100 years, and even then only in the developed parts of the world, people have lived in more or less in communities with a kind of sense of time and place. So they've more or less lived in the same place as their ancestors. They've been able to look back to the traditions of the past and look forward and assume that their culture will go on. That's kind of the normal way of human living now. It's regularly kind of rudely interrupted by wars and natural disasters and the rest of it. But that's more or less how we sort of developed, I suppose, as a creature to live. And modernity, if you like, industrial modernity is a radical break from that past. It's a radical rupture. So it gives us, in a sense, it gives us the whole world in quite a shallow way. We can get on a plane and go anywhere. We can buy food from anywhere. But in exchange for that, we lose that older, deeper sense of roots, that sense of place. And so, yeah, I think that much of the culture war is exactly us grasping at new identities we've created to replace the old ones, and then increasingly starting to fight about that stuff with other people who have it's almost like everybody feels their identity is threatened by the other side, whoever they've identified the other side as. And then off we go. But at the heart of that, there's something deeper. You know, I mean, if you can look at the culture war and you can think, well, if either side won, you know, it would not be much of a victory, because there's something much bigger going on.
Certainly, from my point of view, when I remember after university, having been at school and university in a culture, in a community, and then being sort of thrown out into the world and being very, very confused about what I should actually do in the world. All my friends were sort of scattered to the far corners of the country or even abroad. And that was a real difficult time. And I was reflecting that probably at least part of the reason why I got involved in the Buddhist community was that it did give me a kind of an anchor. It gave me a place, a community with, you're often talking about limits, you know, like we need definitions. We need to be anchored in time and place. It's not always satisfactory. Heaven knows this Buddhist center is not satisfactory. After you've been here for a while, nothing's very satisfactory, but we need that. Like that really helps us. I want to move on because I want to get to your other thing. So, but one thing that really struck me about you is you were a pagan priest for a while. I understand.
Yes, not for too long, but I was. That is true.
In our community, we're often talking about the need for animism, the need to realize that the world is alive. And that we need to become sensitive to that, because we've lost that a long, long time ago. We've lost that faculty to imagine that and feel that. And it's a major lacuna for us when we start practicing Buddhism, for example. I know you practice Zen Buddhism. it's a kind of, you realize after a while that you're missing a piece here of the whole picture, because you've come at it through your own conditioning, your own understanding, and and the cultures that, say, Buddhism or lots of traditional religions came from would have had quite a different understanding of the world. So did your practice of paganism work? What did it do for you?
Well, again, if I look at the context and I tie it in with the other things I've been saying, I suppose this has given me quite a good opportunity to work myself out. It's very handy. Thank you. So if I look at this kind of search I've been on right from the beginning, then, as I say, you can go back to this wandering across the mountains with my dad or getting involved in a road protest. And I had a very, very strong sense that the earth was alive, right? Everything's alive. This planet, whatever it is exactly, is a living being in some way. And the notion that only humans are in any way conscious, or that we have a central role that allows us to dominate and abuse it, or ignore it, which is almost worse. That is a travesty. There's a huge mistake that's being made there. And as I say, as I was saying just now, so I think humans, for the great majority of their history, have lived in rooted communities, but also for the great majority of their history, as you say, they've had a sense that the earth was alive around them. I mean, I live in rural Ireland now, and really until a generation or so ago, and still in a few places now, the folk mythology and the stories of rural Ireland were very, very clear about the living nature of the landscape. You know, the fairies and the creatures that live in the hedges, and the spirits that have to be propitiated, and the trees that you don't cut down, all of this kind of stuff. Nature is not just some inanimate collection of stuff that you can utilize. And as you say, right across the world, whatever the culture, Buddhist, Christian, whatever it is, people had a sense of that. They had a sense of that, and we don't. We've abolished that, and we've replaced it with this pseudo enlightenment notion that the world is a material thing and we're rational and we can work it out with our minds. And another reason I think that we're going through a kind of weird cultural collapse at the moment is that story has played itself out. This modern story, the modern Western story, that the world is just an inanimate object and we can analyze it through science and manage it with reason, is wrong. And we're realizing it's wrong all the time. And it's very, very hard to live in that. And so, yeah, we walked away within modernity, however you quite define that. In the West, we've walked away from our roots. We've walked away from nature as a living thing, and we've tried to build a sort of utopia with our minds. And that's almost the definition of hell, actually, curiously enough. And that's kind of what we've built. Now we have to live with the consequences of that. And for me, that was, I suppose, as I got older, as I got into my late 30s, I realized that all these questions I was asking were not political, really. They were spiritual questions. And all these attempts to sort of arrogantly find out how to solve the world's problems with activism and politics and things were missing the point, because there was a spiritual wound. And so that took me into Buddhism. I don't know why I was attracted to Buddhism, but there was something always I still think there's something very sane about the Buddhist worldview, you know, and it still speaks to me very powerfully. There's very clearly a lot of truth in it in terms of understanding the human condition. And I've practiced that for a long time. But Buddhism didn't reconnect me, as you say, to some degree. Actually, Buddhism didn't reconnect me to the living landscape. There was something missing. And I discovered that what it was is I wanted to worship, actually. I wanted to find God, but also I wanted to find God in nature, because that was the only way I'd ever felt connected to anything divine. I didn't grow up in a religious household. I didn't particularly like religions. So yeah, I ended up becoming, after a lot of exploration of different traditions in the way that lost Western people tend to do, I ended up as a Wiccan, a modern witch, and I joined a Wiccan coven, and I had a little initiation ritual, which was very exciting. And once you become an initiated Wiccan, you're a priest of the gods, or a priestess of the gods. So I was technically a priest for a year or so. In this pagan religion, and it was it's interesting. There's nourishing things in it. It gets you close to nature, but ultimately it's, for me, unsatisfying, because like most neo-pagan religions, it's very much a hodgepodge of stuff that people have come up with over the last 50 years. So a lot of these neo-pagan faiths are modern people's attempts to reconnect with nature and reconnect with God without having to go through a traditional faith, which in the modern world we just strongly resist. We strongly resist authority and structure and tradition and all of these things. We're almost programmed to resist all of that. and we're happy with the idea of God or faith, perhaps, as long as we get to define it ourselves. So that's kind of what was going on. But it was, you know, the satisfying aspect of it was precisely that sense that at least here was something which acknowledged that there was more to life than human beings. And I think that's actually something that we really struggle with in the modern world in the West. We really don't want to deal with the fact that maybe we're not at the center of everything, or maybe we can't control it. You know, maybe we're not in charge. It's a radical thought for us. But yeah, so that was what took me there.
And you, one time when you were practicing paganism, I'm going to get on to talking about God now, slightly nervously, because two bearded Englishmen talking about God is not maybe everyone's cup of tea. But you had this experience that burst through on you. It's not easy to talk about that kind of experience that broke through maybe your early sort of rejection of Christianity. That'd be quite a culturally normal thing for people growing up in South London to reject Christianity, but it broke through, and you became a Christian.
Yeah, that was the most unexpected thing that's ever happened to me. So that's, and as you say, quite difficult to talk about. But I mean, over the last 18 months, really, while I was practicing Wicca, I had a series of very weird experiences, which you can, when you do practice things like Wicca, it really starts to open up aspects of you that were closed before, and all sorts of things come flooding in. And I felt a lot of, it's difficult to describe really. I did write an essay called The Cross on the Machine for a magazine called First Things, which you can find online if you want to read about it in detail, because I can probably describe it better in that than I can here. But really I felt like I was very much being physically dragged away from this pagan practice. And I felt through a series of weird dreams and things that happened to me, and suddenly meeting hundreds of Christians coming at me from all sorts of directions and all sorts of signs and wonders, I sort of found myself, as you say, being directed towards Christianity. And I didn't want to be a Christian. I had no intention of doing that. Didn't particularly like Christianity. The funny thing about people in the West like us, maybe of our generation and younger, is that when we have a sense of a kind of a spiritual calling, we look everywhere except Christianity, because it's precisely because it's our kind of ancestral faith. It's almost like we're vaccinated against it, you know, and we think we know what it is, and we have associations very often with Christianity that we don't think we like, and often we don't like them, right, for good historical reasons. Plenty of things not to like about Western Christianity if you look at it historically. And so that's the last thing you do is you go and talk to a vicar. You know, if you're thinking about God, you go everywhere else. Which is pretty much what I've done in a completely predictable way. But then, yeah, what turns out that Christ likes to come hunting for you. So that was pretty much what happened to me. And I felt very, eventually I had to sort of give in and think, oh, well, maybe there's something going on here. For me, Buddhism was something I went looking for, and paganism was something I went looking for, and Christianity was something that came looking for me, which was unexpected. And that was one of the things that made me think it was real. But one of the objections I had to it was precisely that I thought, well, Christianity is very human-centered. It's all about human dominion. It's all about Western people, and it's all about, you know, sort of power and the rest of it. That's not for me. I've got nothing to say to that. But I started to explore Eastern Orthodoxy, the kind of least known version of the faith in the West. But I had Orthodox friends, and through a very sort of series of strange things that happened, I ended up being shoved in that direction. And starting to look at Orthodox theology and comparing it to the theology of the West made me realize that there was a strain of Christianity, a much older strain actually, closer to the original strain that came to Britain and Ireland, which was very different to what I thought Christianity was. I thought Christianity was a kind of package of moral rules that you had to follow, and then you went to church and the vicar told you how to behave, and then you came home, and if you were lucky, you didn't go to hell if you behaved yourself. And that's really not what was taught in the original church. And Orthodox theology is very much more about a God who's immanent in the world, who's around us all the time. Nature is inhabited by the divine all the time. But also there's a great mystical, monkish tradition still alive in the Orthodox Church. It's a very different form of Christianity. I mean, the fundamental teachings are the same, obviously, but the way that it approaches the kind of the mysteries of life is very different. So yeah, so I ended up, as I say, against my my expectations being baptized in the River Shannon in January, which was extremely cold. So I survived that.
It was. I mean, I read The Wake, which Christianity does get a pretty rough ride in your novel, The Wake, which is a absolutely gripping account of the loss that of a man, the first person narrator in around the time of the Norman conquest. The loss that he suffers being emblematic of the loss that England suffered, and particularly the loss of the old connection with the old pagan gods, and that was already going under the influence of Christianity, and the Norman invasion sort of putting pay to all of that, along with all the customs and traditions. So it was a surprise to read that you had become a Christian. But having read that article in First Things, that made a lot of sense. One of the interesting things that you said in that was that Buddhism taught you compassion, but Christianity taught you love. And I wonder what you meant by that.
Yeah, well, I think God has a sense of humor. That was the conclusion I drew after writing The Wake. He just sort of this will teach you, and this will show you. That was quite entertaining. That's how I saw it. So it's interesting. I mean, this may be a personal thing, but love is at the heart of the Christian faith. Not always very well practiced by Christians, right, including me. But it all turns around that loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, which of course is the thing that none of us wants to do. Obviously loving God, putting yourself second, carrying a cross, all of these things. There's a loving relationship that you have to cultivate with others, and that love it's quite cosmic. It's not a sort of it's quite difficult to describe, but I'm growing slowly to realize what it means, that sort of sense of, love your neighbor. Because when you hear an order like love your neighbor, it sounds like a kind of weird compunction. It's something you're being told to do, and you can't be told to love anybody. You certainly can't be told to love your enemy. But it's really coming from a sense of that kind of holistic oneness that you also find at the heart of Buddhism, which is that when you realize that everything is connected to everything else, then there isn't any alternative but to feel love for every other created being, as the Buddha would put it, because they're all connected to you anyway.
It had a feeling to me that you were sort of, compassion could be quite a universal idea. It could lend itself to becoming a bit abstracted, whereas with the love that you were mentioning in this article, maybe is really personal. It's like the universal made very personal, really coming into a deeply human.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's probably what it is. I mean, I think there's a difference between the Buddha's teaching to have compassion for all created beings and Christ's injunction to love your neighbor, because all created beings is almost an abstraction, right? I mean, in one sense it isn't, but in another sense it is. Jesus doesn't tell you to love the world. He tells you to love your neighbor. And that's quite a specific thing, right? I mean, your neighbor. They're the person who lives next door to you. We could all tell ourselves sort of pompously that we love the human race. We can all sort of do that. But could we honestly say that we love the person who lives next door, or that we've made an effort to? Probably not. Certainly I couldn't. And I think that's true. For me, there was a sense of, in Buddhism, there's a sense of God is missing from Buddhism, obviously. I mean, that's not what Buddhism is. But as you say, the compassion can seem quite dry and abstract. Now, that could just be because I'm doing it wrong. But love is quite a specific thing. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And compassion can be a much more abstract, almost dry notion.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of Buddhist practice is that after a while, one does have to find something more than that. When it's always being pushed along and discovering what one's left out, and moving into this more like the love that you describe would, for me, that would be part of the Buddhist path. And I want to quote one thing you say, which I thought it was lovely. It was about returning to the sacred center around which we need a return to the sacred center around which any real culture is built. That was the end of that essay, and it felt very much to me like you're coming, I don't know about full circle, but you're coming a long way from your sort of, your origins to really feeling that spirituality and a real particular culture that reflects that in the world and that gives space for those neglected capacities that we have for devotion, for faith, for imagination, for connection with God or nature. You've seen right into the heart of something.
I don't know which philosopher it was who said humans are religious animals. Humans, the fundamental thing humans do is pray. I like that idea. But yeah, what I think now, after a lifetime of fumbling about, is that all cultures are built around a spiritual core, and that's the fundamental thing that we're missing in the world. And that is what's led us to this pretty past that we're in. Everything from the kind of the cultural confusion that we're in, the disintegration that we're going through at the moment, to the destruction of nature that we've talked about. If you walk away from the sense that the world is divine, if you walk away from the sense that there's something objectively true and bigger than you, that there is, if you're a Christian, certainly there's a creator who cares about you and who knows about you and who cares about, as Jesus says, cares about every sparrow that falls from the sky and every hair on your head. That is the worldview that most human beings have always had. Obviously not necessarily a Christian worldview, but whatever. I don't think you can look at any pre-modern culture, from the smallest tribe to the biggest civilization anywhere in the world, and find a culture that has not been called around that sense of the divine, however it is expressed and however it is found. And the abolition of that, just over the last couple of hundred years in the West, has created a society that's managed to change the climate, cause a mass extinction, and undermine the basis of its own culture on a widespread basis, and God knows where it's going. It's going to a very dark place, and there is a connection. And to me, that's fundamentally what we have to rediscover: is you cannot have a culture or a life, I don't think, that lasts very long, or that works, that is not rooted certainly in place, but also maybe more importantly in that sense of spirit, in that sense of searching for the divine truth. So that's where I've come to. Much to my own surprise, I suppose, I found it in the Christian faith, which I suppose is my kind of ancestral faith in the West. And it's still a message that's awkward and difficult. It's a very awkward and difficult message to put out in the modern world. It's about the least popular thing you can say. So I was hoping for a quiet retirement, but it's not going to happen, I don't think.
Well, I'm really looking forward to see how your writing develops and how you do manage to communicate that. Because as you say, that is hugely difficult and not an easy thing to describe that, because it's very whole, it's very rich, it's a worldview that doesn't come easily. It's not easy to argue your way into that position. Paul, I really hugely enjoy your work. You always write. You've always written about things that are really, to me at least, centrally important, and you've shone a light on them with courage and with honesty. And I would say that the way that your writing has helped me over the years is that it's opened up the proper dimensions of the problems that we face, rather than them being sort of, I think everybody has a sense of this loss of nature. Well, not everybody, but most of us have a sense of that. And most of us have a sense there's something wrong with this, credit card culture, where we sort of wander around with a credit card and nothing else really. We don't need anything else. We know that there are problems, but you've really brought them into the center and really explored them personally with good argument and great, clarity. So I wish to thank you very much, and thank you for all the soulfulness that you bring. And I think that also what you've opened up is a sense that there are many, many things that we can do. We haven't talked about your life in other ways, but you live on a small holding. There's many ways that we can engage, and it does open up. Your work opens that up for me very well. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. And it's very nice to hear that, because I often feel like I'm just stumbling around. So I'm glad it looks good from the outside.
It certainly does. Thank you very much. And if you want to keep in touch with Paul's work, he has a great website, paulkingsnorth.net. So you can keep in touch with his writing, his old writing and his new writing, and the Substack space is very good as well. Please subscribe to the London Buddhist Centre YouTube channel for more Poetry East videos. We have Alexander McCall-Smith coming soon. And if you want to join the mailing list for Poetry East, please go to About Us at the London Buddhist Centre.com. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.